Have you ever stood amidst a void so profoundly silent that you could hear the reverberation of your own heartbeat echoing within your chest, only for a sudden sound to shatter it all? Not the brittle snap of a dry twig beneath a boot heel, nor the hiss of the wind slicing through the coniferous canopy, but your name, enunciated perfectly, the syllables impossibly crisp and clear. Yet, the true terror does not lie in the realization that something is watching you from the dark. The genuine horror descends when you recognize the voice calling your name. It is not the distorted growl of a demon, nor the clumsy mocking echo of a wild beast attempting to mimic humanity. It is the voice of the one you once loved most dearly, and simultaneously the one you wounded most deeply. A voice that by all rights should have rotted beneath 6 feet of earth a long, long time ago. Before we cross the threshold into one of the deadliest valleys in the Appalachian Mountains together, let us linger for a moment. Tell me, where are you listening to this story from right now? Are you safely curled up on a stone-side dead-bolted house, or are you gripping the steering wheel alone, driving through the night on a desolate stretch of Midwestern highway? Drop a comment below and let me know. I always relish the sensation of knowing exactly into which corners my voice is slithering and keeping you company. Just wherever you happen to be, make sure you slide the deadbolt shut. Because today we shall not speak of the monsters that lurk beneath beds or stalk behind the brush, waiting to tear you limb from limb. We are going to talk about Whisper Hollow, the Valley of Whispers, a place that does not hunger for blood and flesh, but rather starves for the bleeding, putrefying rot festering inside your soul. A colossal mirror forged from bedrock and ancient roots, where karma is no mere abstract concept, but an entity that can breathe, that can watch, and that can call your name. The autumn of 1901 descended upon the Appalachian Mountains without the romanticized beauty found in poetry. Here, as the foliage began its shift into sickly yellows and bruised, bloody reds, the air did not turn crisp. Instead, it carried the pungent, metallic stench of decay, the smell of sawdust, of mold incubating deep beneath the decaying leaf litter, and of things quietly dying to make way for a merciless winter. The sunlight piercing through the canopy seemed too glaring, too desperate, as if nature itself were thrashing in its death throes, attempting to broadcast its final, frantic warnings. Vernon Makepeace, 34 years of age, was a forestry surveyor. If you were to ask the townsfolk scattered about the foothills of the Smokies, they would tell you Vernon was a man of the woods. They would look at his lean, sun-leathered, towering frame, his hands mapped with countless minor scars, and paint a portrait of a nature-loving wanderer, a man so repulsed by the clamor of civilization that he chose to submerge himself in the absolute silence of the deep wild. But those are merely the lies humanity uses to rock itself to sleep. Men who choose to flee into the deep woods, severing all ties with their own kind for months on end, never do so out of a love for flora. They flee because they can no longer bear to look into the eyes of another human being, and in Vernon's case, he was fleeing from his own mind. Vernon's face had been so eroded by the sun and wind that his skin resembled taut leather threatening to tear across sharp, angular bones. His pale blue-gray eyes possessed a habit of looking through objects rather than directly at them. People assumed he was perpetually engrossed in calculating distances or assessing gradients. No one knew that Vernon was, in fact, counting. He counted the number of pine trees in his line of sight. He counted the hoofbeats of his mule, Stub. He counted his own respirations. 4 beats to inhale, 4 beats to exhale. 12 footsteps for every straight stretch of path. That obsessive compulsion was the singular anchor keeping his mind from being ripped apart by the tangled wreckage of his past. Whenever Vernon ceased controlling, ceased measuring, the past would slither up through the fissures in his cerebral cortex. That October, the logging company handed Vernon a hand-drawn map detailing a territory marked as Whisper Hollow. When he asked for directions at the final supply post, the tavern keeper froze, his gaze darting away as he hurriedly polished an already gleaming glass, abruptly shifting the conversation to the weather. The map itself was a forced, disjointed patchwork. The landmarks seemed deliberately misdrawn. The distances stretched to absurd proportions, as if its creator sought to construct a paper labyrinth to deter anyone intent on seeking it out. But Vernon needed the money. And more than that, he needed a place deep enough, remote enough, and dark enough that no memory could ever find him. The trail leading into Whisper Hollow was a narrow laceration of jagged limestone, winding through natural arches thick with damp moss. Vernon led the way, tugging along his mule, Stubb, an aging beast possessing a stubborn streak and an utter apathy toward the world's fluctuations. Yet, the very moment they crossed the invisible threshold dividing the mountain slope from the valley's maw, the spatial shift assaulted their instincts. It was not a gradual transition. It snapped shut like a steel trap. The familiar mixed forest of the Appalachians, with its vibrant oaks and fiery red maples, abruptly vanished. In its place stood a kingdom of ancient pitch-black spruces. Their colossal trunks were wider than three men's embrace, their bark as rough and scaled as the hide of some prehistoric reptile. They grew in suffocating proximity, their branches inextricably woven high above to form an oppressive vaulted ceiling, so dense that the midday sun could only bleed through in sickly, pallid streaks resembling the flesh of a corpse. The forest floor was entirely devoid of underbrush. There was no birdsong, no droning chorus of insects. The space was unnaturally silent. It was not the quiet of tranquility, but the hushed vacuum-sealed stillness of a quarantine ward, a place where every stray sound was sucked dry into the dismal walls. The claustrophobia pressed down heavily against Vernon's eardrums, manifesting a sensation akin to thousands of insects crawling beneath the skin of his nape. He paused, running a hand over the scaly hide of a spruce trunk. His scar-riddled hands trembled slightly. Out of pure habit, Vernon extracted his notebook from his left breast pocket and began to log entries. Black spruce, estimated height exceeding 40 meters, lifespan potentially over 300 years, no signs of axe or saw, an untouched old-growth forest. He clung desperately to those objective numbers, to science, to the mechanical routine of a surveyor to banish the chill that had begun to latch onto his spine. But the mule, Stubb, could not be deceived by numbers. The beast balked, its ears pinned flat against its skull, hooves scraping frantically at the thin layer of humus. It flared its nostrils, sniffing the viscous air, its eyes widening in a manic glaze as it stared intently into the void between two colossal trunks ahead. Animals cannot lie, nor do they possess the capacity to gaslight themselves. They sense what humanity willfully ignores. For his first night in the valley, Vernon pitched camp beside a shallow stream. The water here was horrifyingly clear, like liquid crystal flowing over smooth, polished pebbles. Even as night fell, the water's pristine clarity remained unaltered, reflecting the campfire's glow in grotesque, distorted shapes. Vernon's act of making camp was no ordinary survival routine. It was a ritual of obsession. He arranged the stones around the fire pit into a flawless circle, checking and rechecking to ensure not a single pebble lay out of alignment. He meticulously organized his gear, tools, and the 5-shot Colt revolver in perfectly straight lines upon a canvas tarp. If everything was in its proper place, the world would be safe. That was the lie he had injected into his own veins every night for the past 12 years. As the darkness beyond the firelight began to coagulate into a pitch-black wall, the valley's cold slowly seeped through his wool coat, sinking its freezing teeth into Vernon's flesh. He sat with his knees pulled tight to his chest by the fire, his hands toying with a tin cup of dead-cold coffee, trying to focus on the crackle and pop of the embers. But the silence of Whisper Hollow was too vast. It acted as an enormous sponge, absorbing every ambient noise, leaving a gaping void within his mind. And when the mind is empty, phantoms from the past rush in to fill the void. Unwittingly, the damp, moldy scent of pine needles vanished. Replacing it was the pungent odor of menthol ointment, the bitter stench of medicinal tinctures, and the sickly smell of malaria. Vernon squeezed his eyes shut. His hand gripped the rim of the tin cup so fiercely his knuckles turned bone white. The winter of 1889. A dilapidated wooden cabin on the fringes of town, drowning in agonizing fits of coughing. His mother lay there, buried beneath a heap of faded, threadbare quilts, her frame whittled down to nothing by the fever incinerating her from the inside out. Vernon, then 22, stood at the threshold bundled in a heavy coat, his fingers tracing the freezing silver coins in his pocket, a lucrative advance for guiding a logging crew through the Smokies. Vernon. Her voice was frail, fractured, wheezing like wind hissing through a cracked reed. "Don't go, my boy. I am so cold. Just wait until this night passes." Vernon. But he had left. He had chosen the silver coins. chosen the future of a professional surveyor, convincing himself that the contract would yield enough money to buy her the finest medicines. He had told himself he was doing the right thing. It was the absolute, perfect rationalization of a coward. Vernon had turned his back and walked into the blizzard, leaving an old, lonely mother to draw her final, rattling breath in a freezing cabin with no one there to close her eyes. "No," Vernon muttered, violently shaking his head, forcing his eyes wide open. The fire before him was dying down. The waking nightmare had struck again, as vivid and merciless as ever. He grabbed a piece of firewood and jabbed it brutally into the glowing coals, sending a flurry of embers dancing into the air. "That is the past. You did what you had to do. You did the right thing." But Whisper Hollow cared nothing for sophistry. It was a starving entity, and it had just caught the scent of blood weeping from his festering psychological wounds. Just as Vernon was reaching for his notebook to resume logging meaningless numbers to distract himself, a sound echoed. It began as a profoundly faint rustling, the whisper of wind slipping over the spruce needles. But then, the sound coalesced, twisting together, forming a distinct, sharp word that froze the blood solid in Vernon's veins. "Vernon." The voice drifted from the opposite bank of the stream, just beyond the boundary of the firelight. It was not guttural, it was not horrific in any monstrous sense. It was not an animal clumsily imitating human speech. Vernon's heart skipped a beat, his chest constricting as if crushed by an invisible hand. That voice. The wheezing rasp, the frail yet agonizingly desperate pitch, the way it lingered on the final syllable. It was his mother's voice. Precise, flawless, capturing every microshade of despair from that winter afternoon in 1889. "Vernon, why did you leave?" Vernon vaulted to his feet, knocking the tin cup of coffee over. Driven by sheer survival instinct, his hand snatched the Colt revolver from his hip, his thumb drawing back the hammer with a dry, hollow click. He leveled the pitch-black barrel at the coagulated wall of shadows on the far bank, his blue-gray eyes wide, pupils contracting in absolute terror. "Who is there?" Vernon roared, his voice cracking, spiraling out of control. The quiet confidence of a seasoned outdoorsman evaporated, leaving behind only the pure panic of a child caught red-handed in a heinous crime. "Come out! I am armed!" There were no footsteps, no silhouette emerged. There was only the mule, Stubb, retreating, violently yanking the rope tied to the tree trunk, emitting a series of panicked, snorting whinnies. "You promised you would return before winter, Vernon." The voice rang out again. This time it did not originate from the stream. It had shifted 90 degrees, echoing from the deep timber to his left. There was no sound of movement, no crunch of dry leaves. The entity out there did not seem to walk. It drifted, or perhaps it simply existed in every direction simultaneously. A frigid shudder raced down Vernon's spine. The sheer magnitude of his horror did not stem from a belief that a ghost or demon was circling his camp. A flesh-eating fiend could be slain with lead. But how could you shoot a sin dead? How could you fire a gun into your own cowardice and betrayal as it was being violently hurled back into your face? This valley was not merely attempting to frighten Vernon with random sounds. It was performing psychological surgery on him. It was dragging out the most sordid, agonizing secret that Vernon had spent a decade neatly packaging into numbers, measurements, and perfect geometric lines, and ripping it to shreds in the dead of night. Vernon gasped, the freezing air slashing painfully into his lungs. He took a step backward, inadvertently over the flawless circle of stones he had constructed around the fire. The order was broken. The labyrinth of reason he had so painstakingly built was crumbling to dust beneath the crushing weight of a single whisper. Amidst the suffocating stillness of Whisper Hollow, the hunt had only just begun, and the prey, ironically enough, was willingly surrendering himself to the past. The past had never truly rested beneath those spruce needles. It was simply waiting. 94 years after the night, Vernon Makepeace fell to his knees before the precipice of madness. Whisper Hollow eagerly opened its arms to welcome a new pilgrim, one bearing a different sort of talisman to ward off the dark. This time, the prey brought neither mule nor revolver. He brought the hubris of science. In the summer of 1995, the air within the valley was thick with the blue-gray essence of moss and mildew. Every footfall upon the desiccated bed of pine needles yielded no familiar crunch, but was swallowed whole by the spongy, blistered loam. Ranger Malcolm Dietrich adjusted the straps of his heavy field pack, the nylon fabric scraping harshly against his Gore-Tex jacket in a grating, obtrusive symphony that rudely shattered the profound quiet. A cold sweat beaded on his brow, sliding down the bridge of his nose, carrying the salty, metallic tang of sheer anxiety. Malcolm halted in a clearing where spruce trunks spiraled into one another like gnarled, arthritic fingers desperately reaching up to choke out the meager remnants of sunlight. He shed his pack, extracting a slew of cold, calculating instruments, an EMF meter, an audio spectrum analyzer, a satellite radio, and a digital voice recorder. The electronic beeps sounded pathetically thin and fragile amidst the primordial deep. People said Malcolm was a dedicated ranger, a man anchored in rationalism, determined to unearth a scientific explanation for the legends of Whisper Hollow. They believed he had come to measure acoustic anomalies, magnetic deviations caused by subterranean iron ore, or the dispersion of carbon dioxide from limestone caves, phenomena known to induce hallucinations in the weak-willed. But that was merely the illustrious veneer Malcolm draped over himself. He did not come here out of bravery. He came seeking an alibi. 2 years prior, in a cozy ranger station perched on the slopes of the Cascades, during a blinding blizzard on the west coast, Malcolm had been sitting there. In his hands was a steaming mug of hot cocoa, its sugary chocolate aroma wafting heavily, while the cast-iron stove blazed, casting a sickly yellow glow over his drowsy features. It was his final night shift before the holidays, and then the radio console on his desk shrieked with an abrasive blast of static. Piercing through the interference was the weak, fragmented voice of a climber stranded on a high crag. He was begging for rescue. He said his leg was broken and the temperature was plummeting below freezing. Malcolm had heard it perfectly clearly, but the cocoa was warm and the tempest outside was far too ferocious. More importantly, his mind swiftly forged an easy escape route. That is just static interference. It could be a rogue signal from a station dozens of miles away, or a stupid prank by some skiing kids. He had dialed down the volume on the radio, convincing himself there was no one out there, and dropped his head onto the desk to fall asleep. 3 days later, search teams recovered the climber's frozen corpse. His hands were blackened and rigid with frostbite, still clutching the battered radio. The incident was swept under the rug. Malcolm was transferred to the East Coast, exiled to these smoky mountains as a form of banishment. But a conscience is not something you can leave behind at a toll booth. It followed him, gnawing at him every single night. That torment mutated into a radical defense mechanism. Malcolm desperately needed to prove that Whisper Hollow, the Valley of the Vanished, was real. Furthermore, he needed to prove that the anomalies here were strictly born of physics, geology, or perhaps even some tangible supernatural force. Why? Because if this valley could genuinely fry electronics, scramble compasses, and devour human beings via uncontrollable forces, then the climber's death years ago could also be explained away by acts of God. This frantic crusade of measurement was Malcolm's method of gaslighting his own mind. If these supernatural phenomena are real, then nature killed that man, not his cowardice and negligence. The final rays of sunlight were extinguished behind the peaks, dragging every ounce of warmth from the valley with them. The temperature drop was so violently rapid that Malcolm could feel frost forming on the glass of his wristwatch. The biting air punched into his nostrils, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and a dreadful odor he had tried so hard to forget, the smell of frozen winter gear, the scent of a human freezing to death. He hurriedly flicked on his flashlight. The artificial white beam sliced a feeble incision into the coagulating curtain of black. The EMF meter in his hand began to vibrate. Its LCD screen emitted a ghastly green luminescence. The numbers danced erratically, 10 milligauss, then 50, then spiking to 200. Despite the freezing cold, sweat poured from his armpits, drenching his underlayers. Anomalous magnetic fields, iron ore beneath the limestone bed. It is just iron ore, Malcolm muttered, his voice echoing dry and alien in his own ears. He pressed record on his dictaphone, repeating scientific terminology like a priest chanting scripture to ward off evil spirits. Science was his shield. But Whisper Hollow did not strike at the shield. It aimed a dagger straight into the Achilles heel of the soul. Ksh, ksh. A sound abruptly erupted, not from the brush nor from the canopy above. It emanated from the radio clipped to Malcolm's belt. He jumped, dropping the EMF meter onto the spongy earth. His radio was turned off. Furthermore, at the bottom of this abyssal valley, encased in thick layers of limestone, no standard radio frequency could possibly penetrate. Ksh, ksh. That sound was far too familiar. It was not the wind. It was the physical static of an open radio frequency, the sound of a thumb depressing the push-to-talk button but pausing before speaking. Malcolm swallowed hard, his throat feeling as though it were lined with ground glass. Trembling, he reached down to his hip, his fingers grazing the icy plastic shell of the radio. The inanimate machine was vibrating gently, its signal indicator blinking a harsh, angry red like a furious eye, and then, cutting through the deafening static, a voice spoke. "Ranger, why didn't you come?" Malcolm's heart seemingly stopped, every drop of blood drained from his face, rushing down to legs that threatened to give out. That voice, the hoarse timbre, the lips shivering so violently, they clacked together in a macabre rhythm. It was unmistakable. It was the voice of the climber with the shattered leg on the Cascades years ago. "I'm so cold, Ranger. Are you listening? I know you're there." "No, impossible." Malcolm backed away, his boot heel slamming into the root of a colossal spruce, sending him stumbling. He ripped the radio from his belt, intending to hurl it into the trees, but his hand seemed frozen shut, trapped in a death grip around the object, broadcasting his judgment from the grave. "You're drinking cocoa, aren't you? It smells so sweet, I could smell it, right before my fingers fell off." The scientific shield shattered into 100,000 pieces. Magnetic fields, acoustic waves, geological hallucinations, none of those hollow terms could explain how the thing speaking to him knew about the hot cocoa. The invisible entity of this valley had not borrowed the guise of a feral beast. It had patiently slithered into the deepest chasm of his mind, extracted the audio recording of his guilt, and played it back through the static-laced speaker of reality. "What the hell are you? A hallucination. This is just a hallucination from toxic gas." Malcolm screamed to the dark, squashed ocho and clamped tightly over his ears to drown out the radio. But that freezing voice did not travel through his eardrums. It resonated directly from within the confines of his own skull. The stillness of the valley abruptly shifted. The claustrophobia was no longer that of an enclosed space, but of a presence. The air in front of Malcolm solidified, the temperature plummeting to near freezing in a fraction of a second, turning his breath into plumes of murky white smoke. The putrid stench of rotting meat and rusting iron assaulted his sinuses, causing his stomach to violently spasm. From within the endless wall of shadows ahead, a silhouette slowly emerged. It did not walk with human footsteps. It glided over the muddy earth, utterly smooth and completely silent. Malcolm slowly opened his eyes. The moment the dim beam of his flashlight washed over the creature's face, every desperate attempt to rationalize his reality completely collapsed. It was not a horned demon. It was a man wearing a park ranger's uniform. It stood less than 10 feet away. It cast no shadow, despite the flashlight beam striking it directly and its face. It was Malcolm Dietrich's face, but it was not the flawless replication of a mirror. That face bore a ghastly, emaciated haggardness, heavy dark bags sagging beneath the eyes, hollowed cheeks, and pale lips drooping into a pathetic, cowardly smirk. It was the face Malcolm saw whenever he looked in the mirror during his drunken, self-loathing stupors. The face of an indirect murderer wearing the skin of a hero. The creature wearing Malcolm's face tilted its head, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, the cartilage emitting dry, horrific cracking noises. When it opened its mouth, the voice poured out perfectly smooth, stripped of all radio static, carrying the warm, professional baritone that Malcolm always used to placate tourists. "Can magnetic science explain why you are such a coward, Malcolm?" The entity spoke, its cloudy, milky eyes locked dead upon the ranger's utterly panicked gaze. It took a step forward, a freezing breath billowing into the space between them. "You came here to measure dirt and rocks. You went to the trouble of finding a monster to blame, to prove to the world that nature is fraught with uncontrollable supernatural disasters. You want this valley to be guilty, so that you can be innocent." The creature raised an arm that was far too long, its clammy fingers pointing squarely at Malcolm's chest. "But look closely, Malcolm, between you and me, who is the real monster?" The atmosphere was bled of all oxygen. Malcolm's jaw went slack. He gagged, trying to swallow air, but his lungs felt stuffed with shattered glass. He wanted to run. His leg muscles bunched, but his leather boots felt nailed into the slop of the mud. The entity did not pounce on him, did not bare fangs to rip him apart. It merely stood there, reflecting the entirety of the rot and deceit Malcolm had painstakingly constructed to protect himself. It was gaslighting the man who had gaslighted his own conscience. The darkness of Whisper Hollow no longer merely blanketed the forest. It surged, slithering into his eyes, flooding down his throat, and filling the bottomless pit within his soul. Science was dead. Reason was shattered. In the freezing night of 1995, Malcolm Dietrich finally recognized the most ruthless truth of existence. A man can spend his entire life outrunning the consequences of his sins, but he can never, for eternity, outrun his own face. That merciless truth simply hovered amidst the spruce canopy, waiting for the next fools who suffered the delusion that they could conceal their true nature beneath the sun. But if the darkness above ground merely stripped away the facade of an individual, the darkness deep beneath the earth indulged in a far more sickening pastime. It chewed up and shredded the deceitful tethers connecting one human to another. 9 years after the ranger fled from his own shadow, Whisper Hollow slowly extended its invisible, octopian tentacles deep into the fractured limestone strata, setting a suffocating banquet for those who delighted in burrowing into the gloom. In the autumn of 2004, freezing rains hammered down upon the Smoky Mountains, churning the leaf litter into a slick, viscous mire. But for Randall, Consuela, and Lawrence, the weather on the surface no longer mattered. The three of them were expert spelunkers, adrenaline junkies, addicted to the sensation of being buried beneath millions of tons of bedrock, entrusting their lives to nylon ropes and the flickering, anemic glow of their headlamps. Caves possess no sunsets. They know no cycle of day and night. At a depth of over 300 feet beneath Whisper Hollow, the temperature held at a bone-chilling, terrifyingly stable 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The air reeked of damp limestone, of the root mold that infected the subterranean aquifers, and of a pungent, metallic rust that coated the back of their throats every time they opened their mouths to gulp the thinned oxygen. Every footfall of rubber soles slapping against the slick stalagmites generated a cascade of sharp, clicking echoes that ricocheted off the cavern walls. But the loudest noise inside this pitch-black tomb was not the dripping water, nor the friction of climbing gear. It was the deafening roar of silent betrayals. Randall slithered through a narrow squeeze, his chin scraping against the freezing rock as his rubberized caving suit squealed with every laborious thrust. Just ahead of him was Consuela, her petite frame navigating the fissures with graceful expertise. Leading the vanguard was Lawrence, the man who forever crowned himself the alpha, the shining star of their trio. On paper, they were a seamless, tightly knit team. On paper, Randall was dating Consuela. But darkness is the perfect solvent to dissolve a lie. Randall knew, he knew everything. He had seen the furtive glances Consuela exchanged with Lawrence by the campfire the night prior. He had smelled Lawrence's cologne on Consuela's collar when she embraced him. He knew they were deceiving him, slipping behind his back, mocking his weakness and spinelessness in secret. Yet Randall never uttered a word. He was too cowardly to confront the truth, too terrified of the resulting isolation should he abandon the group. He would rather accept being a pathetic figurehead, feigning blindness to cling to a rotting relationship, than stand alone. He weaponized his silence as an anesthetic to numb his own bleeding pride. But the valley of Whisper Hollow would never permit anyone to enter their lives forever. As the trio descended deeper into the cavernous core, the very texture of the subterranean walls began a grotesque metamorphosis. The frigid, abrasive grit of limestone gradually vanished. Randall's gloved hand fumbled along the tunnel wall, his fingers brushing against a surface that was unnervingly sleek, slick, and warm. It was nothing like stone. That clammy, viscous sensation yielded elastically beneath his fingertips, as though he were tracing the mucosal lining of some gargantuan beast's throat. The space abruptly constricted into a suffocatingly tight arterial tube. The cavern ceiling plummeted, scraping against the very crown of his hard hat. Asphyxiation spittled like a solid block lead hurled squarely onto his chest. Randall was forced to pant in shallow, desperate gasps. With every expansion of his lungs, His caving suit ground violently against the encroaching walls. Microscope dust aimlessly within the beam of his headlamp, burrowing into his nostrils and inciting a maddening itch. Yet he was utterly incapable of raising a hand to scratch it. He was wedged tight. The paralyzing terror of claustrophobia began to extend its razor-sharp talons, viciously lacerating the edges of his sanity. At that precise moment, the headlamp beams of Lawrence and Consuela directly ahead abruptly veered into a diverging offshoot, abandoning Randall to drown in a pool of murky twilight gloom. And then the valley commenced its wicked game. Drip. The sound of water weeping from the stalactites echoed, as rhythmic and metronomic as the ticking of a clock. But a fraction of a second later, those sounds did not reverberate as mere physical echoes. They stagnated, coiled violently into one another, and transmuted into hushed whispers. "He is too slow, Lawrence." Randall froze entirely. His heart violently lurched, hammering a frantic staccato against his ribs. It was Consuela's voice, crystalline and unambiguous, yet it did not emanate from the crevice ahead. That voice bled directly out of the porous, mucus-coated rock pressing intimately against his right ear. "I cannot stomach the stench of his sweat anymore. I cannot stand the way he looks at me like some pathetic, mangy dog begging for affection." "Consuela," Randall called out, his voice trembling uncontrollably, fracturing into brittle shards within the suffocatingly tight space. "What the hell are you talking about?" No reply surfaced from the passage ahead. But from the cavern wall to his left, Lawrence's voice arose, interwoven with a low, guttural sneer, carrying the bizarre, compressed resonance of a sound trapped inside a skull. "Then just leave the bastard behind. He is so utterly pathetic that even if he knew we were sleeping together, all he would dare to do is weep in silence, a spineless coward." A violent shudder of absolute frost plunged down Randall's spine, far colder than any subterranean aquifer he had ever waded through. His stomach violently churned, gastric acid surging all the way to the base of his throat, carrying a foul, corrosive bitterness. He writhed and contorted his body in a manic frenzy, desperately fighting to extricate himself from the rocky vise, wholly indifferent to the razor-sharp outcroppings slashing his rubberized suit and scraping his shoulders raw until they wept blood. "Stop! Stop this sick, twisted game!" Randall roared. But the very moment his scream escaped his lips, it was vacuumed backward into the abyssal dark. The entity residing in Whisper Hollow did not conjure mere hallucinations. It simply extracted the most clandestine, the most filthy, and the most brutally honest thoughts of those present, utilizing the cave's grotesque acoustic architecture to vomit those truths right back into the victims' faces. It was flaying the truth down to the bone. The malady of the echoes had begun to spread. When Randall finally wrenched his body free from the crevice, he collapsed heavily onto the damp cavern floor, panting and gasping like a fish violently thrashing upon dry land. Before him, in a slightly more expansive chamber, the headlamp beams of Consuela and Lawrence were wildly flailing, slashing through the void like erratic swords of light hacking at the empty night. They were in a state of absolute, unadulterated panic. Consuela had both hands clamped ferociously over her ears, collapsed to her knees upon the stone floor, her face drenched in a sickening sheen of tears and sweat, reflecting a pallid, deathly green illumination. She was not hearing the derogatory insults hurled at Randall. She was being relentlessly tortured by an entirely different truth. "Did you honestly think I loved you, you ridiculous whore?" Lawrence's voice ricocheted violently from the cavern roof, crashing down upon the crown of Consuela's head. "You are starting to become a profound nuisance. It is a long, dark drop down this hole. One slip of the foot and you vanish forever. My wife back home will never be the wiser." "No, Lawrence, you're going to kill me. You're planning to throw me away." Consuela shrieked in a piercing crescendo, her voice tearing at their eardrums, laden with the raw, feral hysteria of a psychiatric inmate. She raised her bloodshot eyes to glare at Lawrence, the beam from her forehead shining directly onto his visage, illuminating an identical magnitude of sheer, unbridled terror etched upon the face of the man who styled himself their alpha. "I never said that." "Consuela, calm down. There is something mimicking our voices." Lawrence bellowed, staggering back several paces, his hand frantically fumbling for the hunting knife sheathed at his hip. He too was hearing something. perhaps the desperate cries of his previous victims, or perhaps merely the auditory manifestation of the profound rot festering within his own core. The cocoon of deceit had completely shattered. The trio of spelunkers was now reduced to nothing more than 3 feral beasts locked inside a suffocating cage, utterly stripped of all trust and lethally poisoned by paranoia. The ambient temperature within the cavern seemingly spiked. The air grew cloying, thick, and unbearably oppressive. The reek, sour swat, and the pungent pheromones of naked fear became so concentrated it threatened to suffocate them. "You both lied to me. You trampled all over me." Randall rose to his feet, swaying unsteadily as he retreated behind the boundary of the light. He stared at Consuela, who was wailing uncontrollably, and at Lawrence, who was slashing his blade erratically at shadows. The whispers continued their relentless bombardment from every wall, a sickening symphony of treachery bleeding together into a deafening, skull-splitting cacophony. Without warning, Consuela lurched to her feet. Her eyes bulged, fixed intensely upon a profound, pitch-black offshoot, branching off into the deep right. No one knew what she had just witnessed, or what she had just heard emanating from that bottomless abyss. Perhaps it was the phantom silhouette of a false salvation, or perhaps it was the true, unmasked visage of the devil himself. She let out a feral, blood-curdling shriek, violently tore the safety carabiner connecting her tether to Lawrence, and plunged headlong into the impenetrable dark, sprinting for her life. "Consuela, stop!" "God damn it!" Lawrence roared. He lunged after her for a few desperate strides, his headlamp sweeping frantically through the void, but her silhouette had already been entirely swallowed by the maw of the cave. The splashing of her panicked footsteps, the thud of her stumbling falls, and her despairing screams began to fade, growing fainter and fainter, until they twisted and contorted into horrifying, shrill frequencies, like the sound of fingernails dragging across shards of broken glass. Randall stood rooted to the spot. His feet felt cemented to the stone. His knees trembled violently, turning to absolute jelly beneath his weight. The blood in his temples throbbed in agonizing, rhythmic pulses. The moment of ultimate reckoning had arrived. A true man would plunge into the darkness to save the woman he loved, or, at the very bare minimum, to rescue his comrade. But Randall had never possessed the spine of a true man. Teetering on the razor's edge of life and death, his most subterranean nature clawed its way to the surface. Primordial, unadulterated cowardice. He stared into the pitch-black void from which Consuela's screams were still echoing, and he whispered to himself, "She betrayed you. They mocked you. They deserve everything that is happening to them." A flawless rationalization. An exquisitely vile act of self-justification to camouflage the fact that he was so paralyzed by the fear of death he was willing to pawn off his own humanity. Randall did not take a single step forward. His violently shaking hand reached down to his harness, flicked open the gate of his carabiner, and severed his safety tether from the communal anchor. He pivoted, turning his back entirely on the abyss where Consuela had vanished, and sprinted blindly back the way he had come. He scurried like a sewer rat driven into a dead-end alley. His ragged, wheezing breaths harmonized with the piercing wails of Consuela echoing behind him, forging a deafening, macabre duet. But gradually, Consuela's screams ceased to resemble anything human. They fractured, warped, and transmuted into the silk-tearing laughter of the cavern itself. It mocked her sobbing, it mocked his pathetic cowardice. "Run, you coward, run!" The echoes battered against Randall's eardrums, relentlessly hunting him through every claustrophobic fissure, through every freezing subterranean stream. He crawled blindly, slithering on his belly, tearing all 10 of his fingernails to shreds to claw his way back to the surface. He did not die. He had survived and escaped Whisper Hollow, but as he slumped against the roots of an ancient spruce, drenched to the bone, smeared in blood, his eyes glazed over with absolute horror, he realized the most devastating truth of all. The entity within the cavern depths did not consume Consuela and Lawrence's flesh. It utilized the darkness to coerce them into tearing each other apart, and it forced Randall to willingly castrate the final, lingering shred of his own humanity. His physical shell had escaped, but his soul was imprisoned down there for eternity, transmuted into a sordid, filthy echo, weeping and whining within the limestone belly of Whisper Hollow forevermore. That squalid, whimpering cry, took root within the stalactites, becoming a permanent fixture of the groaning respirations at the bottom of the valley. Yet even echoes inevitably fade with the passage of time, and Whisper Hollow is eternally ravenous. It lay in wait with boundless patience. It knew that human greed and cowardice would never truly vanish. They merely draped themselves in flashier, far more sophisticated veneers as the epochs shift. 14 years after the night Randall forfeited his humanity, the decaying carpet of the valley groaned beneath the weight of new footsteps. Not the frayed leather boots of a fleeing lumberjack, nor the mud-caked, specialized footwear of a reckless splunker. These were arrogant strides striking the earth with the cadence of a man performing in a theatrical play. In the autumn of 2018, the atmosphere of the Appalachians retained its signature, razor-sharp chill, with curtains of fog slinking among the pitch-black spruce trunks like ribbons of pristine morning silk. The pungent musk of millennial mold lurking beneath the loam was abruptly lacerated by a wholly alien the odor of electronic circuit plastics, the scorched circuit boards operating at maximum capacity, and the suffocating waft of expensive cologne drifting on the wind, desperate endeavor to mask the acrid sweat of underlying disorientation. Chase Berceron, 26 years old, was the golden child of the digital era, a survival vlogger with hundreds of thousands of invisible eyes hungrily tracking his every move through flat glass screens. Viewed through the lens of a 4K camera, Chase was a valiant demigod of the wilderness. His swept-back hair was gelled to absolute perfection without a single stray strand, his lips perpetually curled in a defiant half-smile, his broad shoulders enveloped in a rustling, designer mountaineering jacket. He brandished a high-intensity tactical flashlight, carving blinding, merciless blades of light into the primordial night, his mouth running incessantly as he mocked the blood-soaked legends of the Whispering Valley. But behind that blinking red recording light, Chase was a black hole of utter rot. He had never been a survivalist. He was an immaculate parasite. The entirety of his YouTube empire was built atop cheap, stage scripts erected upon the sweat, tears, and literal blood of a behind-the-scenes crew he had never fairly compensated. He bled them dry of their intellect, plagiarized their ideas, and then discarded them with venomous, manipulative vitriol. He gaslit the women who loved him, whittling them down into hollow silhouettes, sowing seeds of clinical depression within their minds solely to maintain the flawless, narcissistic facade of a charming, nonchalant bachelor. Chase's ego was as massive and bloated as a malignant tumor, inflated daily by mindless likes and blindly sycophantic comments on the internet. He genuinely believed he could manipulate reality itself, exactly the way he spliced and color-corrected his fraudulent videos on editing software. That night, Chase selected a campsite upon the very same clearing where, over a century prior, Vernon Makepeace had sat shivering in despair. He erected an obtrusively luminous neon tent, planting a perimeter of high-wattage LED panels that mutated a corner of the gloomy old-growth forest to a blindingly glaring stage, as harsh upon the eyes as the midday sun. The millennial stillness of the valley was ruthlessly violated by the buzzing whine of a drone's propellers hovering overhead, and the electronic beeping of a satellite Wi-Fi transmitter indicating its battery life, and the artificially pitched voice of Chase soliciting engagement from his live chat feed. The temperature plummeted into a free fall the moment the sun was officially entombed behind the darkened ridges. The cold in Whisper Hollow did not seep gradually into the flesh. It slapped you directly across the face. The frigid air slithered through the microscopic seams of his high-tech, waterproof fabric, rooting into his gooseflesh and flash-freezing the beads of sweat forming at the nape of his neck. The scent of the mud coagulated, violently assaulting his sinuses and entirely overpowering the expensive cologne. The bleached, stark light from the LED array seemed to physically contract. The darkness did not fade beneath the illumination. It loomed and clustered aggressively at the periphery of the clearing, standing there like thousands of hollow, unblinking eyes curiously observing a dung beetle digging its own grave. Chase sat cross-legged before the lens, that arrogant smirk still plastered across his face. He rubbed his freezing hands together, babbling endlessly about acoustic resonance phenomena, about the Earth's magnetic anomalies, about how those who came before him were merely weak-minded cowards spooked by the wind howling through limestone caves. He scoffed, dismissing the disappearance of Vernon, the madness of Malcolm, and the cowardice of Randall, as though they were nothing more than nonsensical urban legends concocted to frighten children. And then, the Valley of Whisper Hollow decided it was time to kill the stage lights. The game commenced with an exquisitely subtle constriction of auditory perception. The buzzing whine of the drone hovering overhead abruptly fell dead silent. There was no sound of a crash, no mechanical alarm of malfunction. The expensive piece of hardware simply vanished in mid-air, as though the oxygen surrounding it had petrified into a block of gelatin, swallowing it whole. Immediately following, the laptop monitor, displaying Chase's live stream, began to stutter. The cascading waterfall of adoring praises and hateful slurs suddenly halted, frozen in place. An ear-splitting shriek of feedback ripped through his eardrums, erupting from the ultra-sensitive lapel microphone clipped to his chest. He flinched violently, spitting out a filthy curse, his trembling hands scrambling to rip the audio receiver away. He opened his mouth, intending to deliver a witty to pacify his audience, but his vocal cords seized. The ambient space was suddenly stripped of all oxygen. Chase's lungs underwent a brutal spasm. He gaped his mouth to gulp down the freezing air, but tasted only a bitter, rusted tang rising from his stomach. An invisible pressure bore down upon his eardrums, carrying the clammy sensation of sinking deep into the bottom of a mud bog. From the compact studio monitor positioned beside the laptop, a sound began to bleed out, faintly, frigidly. But it was not the grotesque guttural growl of a feral wolf. It was not the spectral beckoning call of Chase that had so masterfully manipulated the victims of eras past. The entity in Whisper Hollow had evolved to adapt to its digital age prey. It understood that Chase's ego was not tethered to the name given by his parents, but was inextricably bound to the divine mask he paraded before the globe. The sound seeping from the speaker commenced as a whimper. The sobbing hitched in erratic, breathless gasps, trembling and saturated with absolute despair. Chase's heart skipped a beat, the blood in his veins draining as if siphoned. His stomach churned, bile rising with a sickeningly sour burn. It was Sarah's voice. The ex-girlfriend he had gaslit, ridiculed, and psychologically tormented until she slashed her own wrists and was institutionalized early last year. "You told me you loved me. Why did you force me to take those pills and then secretly film me when I lost my mind? Why did you sell that video to them?" Sarah's voice rang out crystalline and razor-sharp, untainted by a single shred of radio static. It transmitted directly through the satellite uplink, piercing the valley's night to stab straight into the ears of hundreds of thousands of live viewers. The chat box on the screen suddenly detonated back to life, but it was not filled with adulation. Thousands of bewildered questions and furious, vitriolic condemnations began to cascade like a torrential flood. "What the hell is this? Audio glitch. It's just radio interference," Chase shrieked, his handsome face contorting into an ugly mask of unadulterated panic. He frantically lunged for the laptop, his rigid fingers clumsily mashing the keyboard in a desperate bid to sever the live stream. But the keys were as freezing as blocks of ice, completely dead and unresponsive. The power button was entirely paralyzed. The primary camera continued to blink its brilliant red light, mercilessly broadcasting the face of a man who had been drained of every last drop of blood. Before Sarah's weeping could cease, another voice aggressively intercepted the broadcast. The deep, gravelly, static-lace baritone dripped with the festering resentment of Mark. Had pushed down a ravine, resulting in a shattered leg, who'd entirely embezzled, and whom he had falsely theft to vescused into silence regarding the staged stunts. "You left me at the bottom of that ravine groaning all night. You stole all my raw footage. You aren't human, Chase. You are a blood-sucking tick." A cold sweat erupted, drenching his inner thermal layers, plastering the fabric to his flesh, and inciting a maddening, crawling itch, as if an iron quill were violently scratching across his spine. The forest wind abruptly resurrected into a howling gale, violently whipping the rotting, desiccated leaves into a spiraling vortex around where he sat. The dry leaves scraped against the synthetic nylon of the tent, producing a grating, hissing friction like tens of thousands of centipedes slithering in unison. The illumination from the surrounding LED array began to strobe erratically, shifting from brilliant white to a sickly, jaundiced yellow, before ultimately decaying into a morbid, bruised crimson resembling dried blood. The entity did not physically manifest. It had no need to drape itself in a putrefying corpse and step out from the shadows to strangle him. It was flaying him bare right before the eyes of the public, the singular deity that Chase worshipped, and the only thing he was mortally terrified of losing. Dozens of voices began to broadcast simultaneously through the audio interface, funneling straight into the amplifier, forging a barbaric symphony of indignation, curses, and bloodthirsty screams from the victims he had mercilessly trampled upon. They did not echo aimlessly through the physical air of the forest. They penetrated directly into the electronic circuit boards, transmitting across continents. "Stop! Stop it right now! All of you, shut your mouths! I am the victim. Someone is hacking my equipment." Chase collapsed onto the damp, moss-covered earth, both hands clutching his head, his fingernails tearing frantically at his own scalp until it bled. He screamed into the camera lens, his face twisting in the violent convulsions of a narcissist whose delusions had just been pulverized. Saliva drooled from the corners of his mouth. Copious tears hopelessly blurred the eyes that had once been so remarkably arrogant. The flawless shell of the wilderness demigod had shattered into 1,000 pieces. Before the unforgiving 4K close-up, Chase was stripped utterly naked, revealing the true, pathetic form of a cowardly parasite, weeping, whimpering, and begging for pity. Yet the continuously flashing strobe light callously and relentlessly illuminated every hidden crevice of that wretchedness. Unable to endure the agony of being seen for what he truly was, he threw a punch at the lens, desperately trying to smash it and force the screen to go black. Bizarrely, the camera glass had hardened to the density of solid steel. The desperate blow shattered the knuckles of Chase's fingers, the bones producing a dry, sickening crack. Fresh blood welled up, carrying a metallic tang that mingled with the scent of the damp loam. Agonizing pain rocketed into his brain, but he was entirely incapable of screaming. His throat felt as though it had been filled with molten lead that had solidified into a suffocating mass. In the final fleeting seconds of the broadcast, the darkness surrounding the valley from all four sides ceased its hesitant probing. It surged, flooding into the clearing like a tidal wave of viscous black ink. The LED panels detonated, one by one. Pop, pop, the light was devoured entirely. The final image that hundreds of thousands of internet spectators witnessed before the feed cut to a dead, pitch-black screen was not a fanged, clawed beast lunging to tear their favorite vlogger apart. They solely witnessed a hyper-detailed close-up of Chase's face, his bloodshot eyes rolled back in absolute, unadulterated terror, captured in the exact moment he realized he could no longer use editing software to cut and crop this reality. He had been stripped of the most dangerous weapon of his entire life, his mask of lies. The absolute, merciless silence crashed back down upon Whisper Hollow. The scorched scent of ozone was gradually swept away by the wind, returning the valley to its eternal pungent musk of moss and decaying leaves. The entity did not consume the physical flesh of Chase Berceron. It simply chewed his delusional ego to shreds, dragging every one of his filthy crimes out into the light, and abandoned him as a hollow husk, a raving lunatic, forever doomed to wander the deep woods. A man who, now bearing mangled, shattered hands, would perpetually mutter lies that not a single soul left on this earth would ever bother to listen to again. The bloodiest hunt of the digital age had concluded, shrouded in a profoundly suffocating silence. That suffocating, absolute silence was not a period marking the end of a sentence. It was merely the satisfied, exhaling breath of Whisper Hollow after it had sucked the final marrow from its prey's ego. The ancient spruce canopies shuddered faintly, shaking off their fragile coats of frost, restoring the night to its primordial, undisturbed gloom. The blistered, muddy loam beneath the feet slowly stitched its mouth shut, swallowing the dried bloodstains and the acrid ozone of the digital era, patiently and sullenly waiting for a fresh layer of autumn leaves to fall and obscure all evidence of existence. The valley was in no rush. Time, to it, was nothing more than a crust of rust, clinging to the frigid limestone boulders, grinding together to produce a droning, meaningless hum. And now, as the shadows of the Smoky Mountains have retreated deep into yellowed field notes and corrupted data files, I sit here in a room illuminated by a single incandescent bulb casting a trembling, sickly yellow glow. The chill from the narrative seems to have slipped through the cracks of reality, slithering into this space to wrap tightly around my shoulders. I raise the cup of dead-cold black coffee to my lips. The bitter liquid slides down my throat, leaving a harsh, astringent aftertaste akin to chewing on raw roots. The odor of antiquated case files permeates the air, a pungent scent of decaying paper, of settled dust, and of buried secrets desperately yearning to be exhumed. For years, people have relentlessly spun dozens of macabre theories regarding Whisper Hollow. They scour the archives of Appalachian folklore, hunting for the silhouette of the flesh-flaying skinwalker, or the gaunt, starving form of the Wendigo lurking behind the ancient trunks. They yearn to graft a discernible demonic face onto the valley. Why? Because humanity invariably finds a bizarre comfort in attributing tragedy to supernatural forces. If you are devoured by a beast of flesh and bone, you are merely a tragic victim, an innocent soul robbed of life by the sheer brutality of nature. The concept of a physical monster is the most comforting shield available to protect the fragile ego of mankind. But speaking from the vantage point of one who has spent over a decade tearing away the glamorous veneers of criminal psychology cases, I find this valley to be infinitely more ruthless and sophisticated than any bloodthirsty creature. Whisper Hollow is not a colossal stomach designed to digest flesh. It is a gigantic mirror, silvered with the mercury of karma and framed by millennial roots. A mirror that reflects no physical form, but rather the putrefaction of the humanity concealed within. The invisible entity haunting that dark abyss never actively snatches away anyone's identity. It merely, patiently, slips its freezing, unseen fingers under the edge of the mask its victim wears and slowly peels it away. Look back at Vernon Makepeace. He marched into the deep woods, cloaked in the guise of a nature-loving wanderer, a hardened man of the wild. But it took the valley only a single night to strip away the illusion, exposing the truth that he was nothing but a coward, nailed to an obsessive-compulsive disorder his entire life just to outrun the ragged coughing of the elderly mother he abandoned in a blizzard. He was not torn apart by a beast. His sanity was blown to pieces by his own guilt. Look at Malcolm Dietrich, the ranger draped in the uniform of pride and rationalism. He attempted to use EMF meters and the lexicon of physics to construct a fortress of logic. Hoping to imprison the night, he ignored a climber's desperate plea for rescue. And what did the entity do? It hurled that deafeningly static-laced radio straight into his face, projecting his own cowardly, deceitful visage onto the canvas of the dark, forcing him to confess that the force manipulating reality was not magnetic fields but his own spinelessness. And then we have Randall, the man who utilized his own weakness as a shield for the ultimate depravity deep within the caves. Or Chase Bergeron, the parasite of the digital age, who deluded himself into believing that mindless online metrics could warp the scales of karmic justice. The valley did not lay a single finger upon a hair on Chase's head. It simply stripped him of his illusory crown, broadcasting every whimpering sob and every act of narcissistic cruelty for the entire globe to behold. It wielded the truth, the very weapon Chase had forever despised and trampled upon, to pulverize his soul into microscopic dust that could never, ever be reassembled. They all stepped into Whisper Hollow wearing a disguise, and the entity merely performed an unanesthetized surgical operation, flaying the festering flesh of their deceit, betrayal, and insidious selfishness. The absolute terror in this valley does not originate from savage, guttural growls. It seeps into the bloodstream in the form of a whisper, that you are not grand, you are not brave, and you are not as innocent as you perpetually lie to yourself to believe. The darkness out there has no fangs, but it possesses a memory. It regurgitates the traumas you have inflicted upon others, blends them with the corrosive acid of belated remorse, and spoon-feeds it back into your mind until you drive yourself into madness. We constantly fear wandering into a deep, sunless forest, but the grim reality is that the most terrifying thing in this world has never been the darkness of nature. The most terrifying thing is the exact moment you are stripped of all your psychological defense mechanisms, left without a single excuse, and forced to stand entirely naked before the most primal, rotting version of yourself. The chill in the room seems to drop another few degrees. The lamp on my desk flickers with a tired pulse, casting mottled, distorted shadows that dance across the pallid walls. The silence now is not that of the ancient American woods, but the suffocating quiet of the very reality in which we currently reside. A reality where millions hide behind anonymous avatars, behind drawn curtains, daily constructing petty lies just to survive without the agonizing sting of a guilty conscience. I draw a deep breath, feeling the freezing air fill both my lungs, and offer a bleak, cynical smile. I feel as though I have just finished digging a massive psychological grave with my own two hands, the dirt and grit still packed tightly beneath my fingernails. So, I want you to close your eyes for a few seconds and imagine, if tomorrow, during an aimless journey, you mistakenly step across an invisible boundary and wander into a valley just as desolate as that one. The air abruptly thickens. The stench of sawdust and decaying leaves assaults your nose. You stand there, dwarfed by rows of towering spruces, and then, from behind the freezing limestone boulders, the darkness begins to part its lips and whisper the secrets you have spent your entire youth burying. The pain you inflicted, the vile lies you carelessly dropped, the people you coldly turned your back on and discarded. They all simultaneously raise their voices to call your name, in distorted, bleeding tones. In that very moment, would you possess enough purity and courage to keep your head held high and walk forward without glancing back? Or would you end up exactly like Vernon, like Malcolm, like Chase, collapsing to your knees, fleeing in a frenzy of panic screams, leaving your hollowed soul at the bottom of the valley for all eternity? The truth of your ego, in the end. Is it a sturdy, impenetrable shield, or is it merely a ragged layer of wrapping paper, ready to be ripped to shreds at the mere sound of your name? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. Do not hesitate, because, as I have said, the dark always holds enough space to harbor every hidden corner. Do you believe the true nature of Whisper Hollow is an anomalous supernatural force, or is it simply a colossal psychological trap woven entirely by the karma of mankind itself? If the freezing chill of today's story is potent enough to slither through your warm blankets and keep you tossing and turning tonight, then do not forget to leave a like and subscribe. It is not merely an act of support for the channel, but a physical milestone reminding you that you just stared directly into a dark chasm of humanity and made it out safely. Just remember one thing very clearly before you drift into sleep tonight. If one day you find yourself walking through a desolate forest, or perhaps simply pace down the dim hallway of your own home, and you suddenly hear a familiar voice call out your name from some obscured corner, do not turn around, do not attempt to seek out its source, and never under any circumstances answer back, because it is highly probable that it is not a ghost or a monster stalking its prey. It is merely the call from the ruthless part of your own humanity that you are so desperately trying to conceal. And the moment you speak up to acknowledge it, you will have permanently handed it the key to swallow your life whole. Stay safe. I will see you all in the next case files where the darkness never truly sleeps.